Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Can folks hear me okay in the back? Great. Well, it is a great pleasure to be with all of you. I really love to make these relatively informal. So, as I always tell the students at Kellogg, I have virtually no answers, but like many of you, I have a lot of opinions. So I thought we could talk a little bit about leadership. I would say up front that I'm very honored to be able to spend some time with folks who really love the institution as you do. I think myself, in a way, I really never left Northwestern. I always tell folks, I tell my wife I went to Kellogg a couple years ago, and my wife says, no, you went to Kellogg 35 years ago. And I tell her, but Julie, you were there 34 years ago, and then she stops talking about it. But when I was at Northwestern, my finance professor was a fellow named Don Jacobs, who did fairly well. He became the dean, and I was his teaching assistant, so I ended up going to Baxter. I was going to go to Baxter Healthcare for 2 years. I forgot to leave, and I was there for 25 years. But while I was there, Dean Jacobs, anybody who knows him, he would always call me every 2 or 3 weeks, and he'd say, Harry, I need you to be on a panel, or I need you to be a guest speaker. And I said, hey, if it wasn't for Northwestern Kellogg, I never would have been the CEO of Baxter, so Don, I'll do whatever you tell me to do. So that happened every 2 or 3 weeks for 25 years. So 7 years ago, when I was leaving Baxter, the day I was leaving, he called me with Deepak Jain, who was the subsequent dean. He said, Harry, before you jump into anything, I just want you to know we want you to teach. I said, hey, I'll do anything for the school. Give me a night. I'll stop by. Dean Jacobs said, no, you're not tracking me here. I don't want you to stop by. I want you to teach. And I said, you don't mean have a syllabus, grade papers. That's not happening. And he said, at 80 years old, he said, Harry, I think you said you do whatever I told you to do. So, okay. And as we all know, whatever we do, none of us truly ever get beyond the first grade. So here I am. And he thought I was going to teach finance, but I just figured the world we're living in today, I'd really like to focus on leadership value and ethics. So I started teaching, and as any of you that have done any teaching probably realize the same, until I can explain something clearly to a group of very bright people, I may think I understand it, but not really. So it really is a blessing. I thoroughly enjoy teaching, so I try to do quite a bit of it. And as I'm running around with Madison Dearborn going to board meetings, I always tell the Northwestern folks, if I'm in a certain city and I can talk to some of the alums, I always enjoy doing that. So the thought process here is to talk a little bit about leadership. And we got a lot of leaders in the room, so you probably share some of my concern, which is everybody talks about the fact that we need more leaders. I mean, you hear this every day. We need more leaders in government, academia, spiritual leaders, business leaders. But what I find interesting is very few people ever get very specific. What do we actually need concretely to do for all of us to become better leaders? And for those of us that are fortunate to be in a leadership position, how do we actually develop the next generation of leaders? So having thought through this the last 35 years on various companies, boards, small companies, large, private, public, for-profit, not-for-profit, domestic, global, I've tried to keep this very simple so I don't confuse myself. I have a couple of characteristics that I'll share with you, and then a couple of principles. And as I go through these, feel free just to jump in. Feel free, you can ask anything. One of the key parts of leadership, as we know, is delegation. So if you ask me something fairly simple, fairly straightforward, I'll take a crack at it. If it's more cerebral, thought-provoking, a couple of my students are here. We'll have them answer the question. So delegation's a big piece of this. I'm incredibly comfortable with this, if that's okay, Jim. All right, so, and as I talk about a couple of these, think through people that you've known, worked for, read about, how many of these characteristics do they have? And since we're all trying to become better leaders, how many of these would you honestly say, I'm pretty good at that, but this one, I could probably get a lot better at. And we'll go through some of these characteristics and principles. That make sense? Okay? You're going to be engaged here, right? You're not watching a movie. You're going to jump in, right? Okay. I always tell the students, you can either watch the movie or be in the movie, okay? So, where I like to start is when I think about leaders, one of the first things I find, and hopefully you do this in your boards and your clubs, organizations. See, I'm lucky too, because I have one of these boards. I'm into this professor thing now, so I have to use them. The first characteristic I always think about in terms of strong leaders is that these are people that are capable of keeping things simple. Now, think about what usually happens in whatever you're doing. Somebody well-intentioned will come up, and maybe their name is Joe, and they'll say, Harry, I need to talk to you. This is very, very complicated. I'll say, well, Joe, I got a better idea. Why don't you go back to your office? Why don't you figure out how to keep it simple? And then we'll talk about it. But Joe's very driven, so Joe says, Harry, it's very complicated. I say, well, Joe, that's why we have you, okay? That's why we pay you, right? Or as I would quote my grandfather, that's why they call it work, right? And then you have to kind of explain to Joe that if it was already simple, we wouldn't need Joe, right? So this whole idea of being able to keep it simple is huge, right? One of the expressions you'll sometimes hear, that somebody will say, well, what kind of person is Mary? And they'll say, well, hardworking, very conscientious. But the problem with Mary, quite candidly, is she sort of gets lost in the trees. She doesn't see the forest. Are you familiar with that expression? Sort of lost in the trees, you don't see the forest? Having done this for a number of years, and many of you have probably seen this, there's a lot of people out there who never get to the trees, right? These are the people that are in the root system, okay? They're in the root system, they've seen one or two trees, but the idea of the forest, forget it, okay? It's like the fourth dimension for these folks. And what I challenge folks, I challenge all of you is, and this is where you have to be honest with yourself, how good are you really at getting from the roots to the trees to the forest? Putting things in perspective, looking at things holistically. How does all this tie together globally? And again, because I think we've all been blessed to go to an institution like Northwestern, I think that's one of the things that we do here, of giving people that global perspective. Rather than we're the world's expert in one small area, having some understanding how all this fits together and being able to keep it simple, right? By the way, where this ends up now in a practical way is think of the number of people who have a hard time defining what is the issue or what is the opportunity, right? Many of us spend a lot of time in conference rooms. It's amazing how much of our work life we're in conference rooms, right? And we're in there a lot. Why? Because for a certain degree, nobody's exactly sure why we're in the conference room, right? And how long are we going to be in the conference room? Well, I got to leave now because it's 9, because now I got to go to another conference room, right? As opposed to what is the issue? It could be opportunities. It's got to be one or the other. If there's not an issue or an opportunity, I'm not sure why we're in the room, right? But if it's an issue or an opportunity, very simply, what are the alternative ways of dealing with it? On what basis are we going to choose one of them? And once we've chosen one, how are we going to execute, implement, and make it happen, right? Keeping it simple, put it in perspective. Another characteristic, I think, of strong leaders is that they employ common sense. And some executives will say, well, we don't need to waste a lot of time on that. That's sort of obvious. Isn't that a given? I always quote Mark Twain, American author, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer. Supposedly, Mark Twain was fond of saying, he said, if you stop and think about it, everything is common sense. The problem is that common sense is not common, okay? Now, actually, I thought this was a cute turn of phrase, but it turns out it's true, right? Think about what happens in a conference room. And of course, we have folks here so we can pick on. So Jim is in the conference room with Scott. And Jim says, Scott, I know this doesn't make any sense, but here's the interesting part. Jim continues to talk. Okay. Now, it's interesting because Jim has admitted it doesn't make any sense, has not slowed him down at all. He's continuing to talk. That's interesting. Also interesting, though, is Scott, who has heard Jim say that it doesn't make sense, Scott doesn't stop him. Why does Scott not stop him? Because Scott looks at it and says, we don't know why we're here. We don't know what the issue is. We can't leave till 5. Jim, just keep talking, okay? Literally, this goes on in conference rooms, right? As opposed to Scott saying, very respectfully, we're always going to be respectful. Jim, honestly, you said 1, 2, 3. Now you said Mars. I'm not making the connection here. What are you talking about? Very respectful, right? Because we can't waste a lot of time. Simple, common sense. One more characteristic I think is important, and this is particularly important for younger leaders and those of us that are developing younger leaders, is that the real true leaders, in my mind, start ASAP. They start as soon as possible. And again, you should challenge all this. Here's the way I think about this. When you talk to younger leaders, we have some of them in the room, often what they'll say is, I know this leadership stuff is important. Someday, I'm going to be one of these folks, so I'm going to take great notes. But just for the next couple of years, it's not that applicable to me because right now, I don't have anybody reporting to me. I'm a single contributor. I'm on a team. So, you know, this leadership stuff is just going to have to wait for the future. I said up front, I have very few answers, but a lot of opinions. One of my very strong opinions that should be challenged is that the people that are the leaders are the people who start leading long before they have anybody reporting to them. And I don't know if you've thought about this, but those of us that have been around for a while, I immediately go back 35 years ago to Baxter Travenol. There were 30 young guys there. None of us were leading anything. We were all in little cubicles or a bullpen. But you knew almost immediately a couple people that were going to be leading something. It was a little too early to tell would they be running a division, the whole company, a function, a geography, but you knew they'd be leading something. And I think the question you have to ask yourself is, what was it about these people? And I've come to the conclusion that these were people who decided they were going to start leading ASAP. They weren't going to wait until they had a certain title. They weren't going to wait until they had 12 people reporting to them. They were good at keeping it simple, figuring out what needed to be done, employing a little common sense, and then just going for it. And again, if you think about it, what usually happens to many of us is we get really caught up in the organizational chart. You know, there's an organizational chart, and there's boxes. And if you think about it, the people that are the leaders don't get caught up in all the boxes, right? They're respectful because some people really care about these boxes, right? But the people who really want to get things done, they figure out a way to maneuver through the morass and get things done, right? Because among other things, I think they've figured out it's not about the org chart and who reports to who, it's who can get things done, right? And in most organizations, it really is about the customer. Right? And again, I know this sounds like common sense. People say, well, yeah, well, that's the only reason the company exists. Interestingly enough, those of you that have been in big companies, there's really an unfortunate thing that occurs. Because the larger the organization gets, and we get more broken up into functional areas, there's a lot of people in a lot of these organizations who don't realize that if it wasn't for customers, there would be no organization. Right? One of the things I used to do at Baxter that used to drive people a little crazy, I'd walk through one of the hallways and there'd be a conference room. And there could be 10 folks in there. They could be in IT, information technology, human resources, finance, whatever. And they're in a meeting. They got the PowerPoint thing going. I'd open the door, and I'd say, name 3 customers. Now, if you do that to a group of some functional folks, the expression on their face, I've actually come up with my own word, okay? And the word is M-E-G-O. MEGO. It stands for my eyes glaze over, right? So you say to 10 HR guys, name 3 customers. The guy says, can you give me a hint? How long have you been with the company? 15 years, right? And you don't know we sell intravenous fluids and drug delivery devices, renal care products for patients? No, I'm a human resource guy. Okay, no, I think you're a Baxter guy who happens to be in human resources, all right? So that ability to understand what this is all about becomes really huge, right? But I think you have to really get started very, very quickly, right? Now, here's another challenge. I think for younger folks to say, well, hey, I tried. I tried to get started, but the system sort of slowed me down. And here's what usually happens. And having talked now to hundreds of companies and associations, I realize even though each of us in an organization thinks our organization is unique, it turns out that most of them are almost exactly the same because it's all people, right? And I've seen this a lot. Here's what typically happens, okay? So use some examples here. What's your name? Emily, okay, and your name? Elizabeth. Okay, so Emily has this great idea. Emily says, you know, we should do something here. This is an issue. The whole organization will be better off if we did something about this. Let's do something about it. And Elizabeth says, wait a minute. Sounds great, but we have to wait. And it turns out we have to wait for a group of people. It's interesting, though, this group of people exists in every company. In fact, they got the same name. Because Emily says, well, who do we have to wait for? And Elizabeth says, well, we have to wait for a group of people that are called those guys. Okay. This is interesting. These people exist all over the world. They do. So where it gets really frustrating, and by the way, when I say guys, I always say men and women. So Emily says, well, but I got this great idea. Well, what are you waiting for? I know it's a great idea. We just have to wait for them. That this is where it gets frustrating, though, because Emily says, well, who are those guys? Elizabeth says, this is the biggest problem of all. We don't know who they are. Okay, we don't know who they are, okay? Now, as this discussion's going on, though, there's a very young person in the room. He's only been around a month. He's like an intern, and that's Jim in this little story. Jim listens to this, and Jim says to himself, you know, Emily's got a great idea, but we have to wait for those guys. But here's the key what Jim picks up on. Nobody knows who they are. So Jim says to himself, I'll just tell them I'm one of those guys, right? So he says, Elizabeth, let's go. You must not have heard Elizabeth's comment about we have to wait. I am one of those guys. That's how this gets done. People who realize they're one of those guys. Now, this brings up a really interesting issue. I get very interested in all this. How soon do you wait till you get started? And one nice thing about teaching is when I started this 7 years ago, I said, maybe you get 2 or 3 years of experience. Well, maybe you start within a year, 6 months. Is it as an intern? How early do you start? I've rolled this thing back enough now that I use family examples. My wife, Julie, who's also a Northwestern alum, she and I have 5 children, 25, 21, 17, 14, and 10. I describe it as significantly more complex than managing 50,000 people at Baxter ever was, all right? Because as you folks know, you're in a large organization, you ask people to do things nicely, they may do it, okay? Not the situation at my house, right? Now, so here's the story that I've been using lately. My little guy, who's now 10, I guess it was now 5 years ago, he was graduating from kindergarten, right? When I talk to international folks, I have to explain, among some of the challenges and issues we have in this country, because I know we want people to have a lot of confidence, we give diplomas now to kindergarten people, all right? All right, which is interesting. It demonstrates my age as well, because when I was growing up, we graduated once. My children graduate from something every 2 years. I mean, it's amazing how many graduations I've been to. So I'm at this kindergarten graduation. Why? Julie told me to be there, right? After 34 years, I show up. So I'm at this kindergarten graduation, and when you're a professor, you watch everything. I mean, you watch the dynamics, the people side of this, right? So the first thing I noticed at this kindergarten graduation is none of these little people knew why they were there. None of them. They're just there. They're milling around, all these little, 3-foot people, and they're standing in line. And the principal's ready to start the program. They got a band, which is the 2nd and 3rd graders with their instruments. They're all ready to roll. Now, here's the key part. Right as they're ready to roll, I notice in the middle of the line, in this ceremony, one little boy has a soccer ball. And he's getting a little fidgety, and all of a sudden this young fellow yells out, let the mom and dads pick up the paper, which I think he meant the diplomas. Let's go play soccer. So at that moment, 25 little people followed this guy to the back of the school, okay? The principal's a little annoyed. I'm watching this. Now, I knew I had been already teaching too long because I had this incredible desire to interview this child, okay? Think about this, okay? Think about this. No org chart, no paychecks, no performance management objectives. They just followed them. So, because I'm writing about this stuff, I'm reading it, and I thought, I'm going to grab this little guy and interview him. And Julie said, don't touch the little boy, okay? Good advice. So I said, no, I won't, but I definitely can grab Daniel. Daniel's my son, 5 years old. So I grabbed Daniel and I said, Daniel, Daddy's not mad, but Daddy teaches this at Northwestern, Kellogg. This is what I do. I have to understand, what just happened? What just happened in front of this school? And he said, Dad, Billy does this every day. He does this kind of stuff every day. And I said, well, what do you guys do? He said, we do whatever Billy tells us to do. Okay. All right. I tried to hire Billy for Madison Dearborn, okay? He's in the 4th grade now. Trust me, he's going to be going to Northwestern very soon. Now, that night I had my leadership class, and I went through this story. And again, I get most of my ideas from the students. And one of the students, when I was telling this story, said, one of the things we all talk about, and I'm sure you folks have thought about this in your organizations, where does this leadership stuff come from? Are you born with it? Is it developed? Is it nature, nurture? That whole discussion. And he said, let's use a sports analogy. He said, there are some students that are born with an amazing natural athletic ability, right? But they're not disciplined, they're not focused, they don't train, they never reach their full potential. But he said, then there are other students, other children, that maybe have a third of that potential, but they're disciplined, they're focused, they're trained, and they win a gold medal. So he said, so what is it? Is it nature, nurture? You're born with it, developed? We concluded absolutely yes. Yes. If you happen to be blessed with something in the tank to start with, okay, you got a slight advantage. What you do with it, how you develop it, how you realize every day we're given, we can be better than the day before, it's all part of the journey. All right? So this whole idea of keeping things simple, getting some common sense, and getting started as soon as you can, I think are all important characteristics of somebody who's going to be an effective leader. Okay? So that's a couple of characteristics. Any comments, thoughts, anything? You said you weren't going to be shy here. Anything? Yes, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Your point about starting as soon as possible, even before you're in an official leadership role, makes me think of the Heifetz's work about leading without authority.
Yep.
So there are people who aren't necessarily officially leaders on the org chart who, what you just described, they're just sort of taking it up. And a lot of that can, in places I've worked, can start to become part of the culture. Others may not pick it up because they're not dispositionally equipped to do so. They just want to follow along. But I like places that sort of opportunity is available because the other people will sort of come out of the woodwork, and it becomes more of an opportunity for knowledge promotion than in a place where the people who are officially authoritative or in positions of authority are driving work. It's more organic. It's more.
Well, great point, Elizabeth, because those people that have actually thought about this, I think, realize, and this is a key point you're making, leadership has nothing to do with control. It has everything to do with the ability to influence people. How can you influence people if you can't relate to them? And the people that are really the best leaders, I find, are the people who have reached a point where they no longer need to be right. They're fanatically focused on doing the right thing, right? And I think leaders, and we'll talk about some of these principles in a minute, but I think the leaders who really get it realize the percentage of time that they themselves will come up with the answer is rare. All right? I mean, I used to tell my folks at Baxter, on a really good day, maybe I knew 20% of the answers, to which they'd say, that's high. It's not that high, okay? But if I've got a great team of people, okay, and if they know I really want them to know what they think, then it becomes exponential, right? But the team has to actually believe you really want to know, right? If I say, hey, Scott, tell me what you think, and Scott knows he's thinking something different than I would ordinarily do, he asks himself one question. All right? When was the last time Harry changed his mind? If the last time Harry changed his mind was 1990, why is he going to waste his breath? Right? He has to actually believe I have no interest or need to be right. And the more people that can actually make decisions and think differently and not have this sort of top-down thing, it becomes exponential in terms of how much you get done. Yes?
Have you found or observed or seen, or is there research about any generational differences in how this plays out? You know, there's a lot of workplace discussions now about, oh my God, the millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And your example of the kindergartner would say it isn't generational.
Yeah.
But
yeah. So,
thoughts about that?
okay, so thoughts. And is this why, what's your name? Dita, this is a good example of why I said up front, opinions, not answers, right? Because there are a lot of people doing a lot of work that are really focused on, you know, baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, and so on, which, again, when I think of balance, which is going to be one of the principles, I think there's something we can learn from that. However, I actually believe every single person is different. Right? So the danger to me is saying, oh, well, that's Gen X and that's Gen Z. As if, am I going to treat all these people the same? And all? No, you're going to treat each person uniquely. Right? It's a little bit like saying, okay, I'm one of the baby boomers. Well, there's a lot of difference between all of us, God knows. All right? So I think trying to package people into these pockets, a little bit dangerous. I think you can get some general, but I think you want to be able, if you've got a team of people, I think you want to be able to relate to each one of those people uniquely. You know, some of them are very money-oriented. Some of them need to be recognized. Some of them are trying to create other balance in their lives, right? So the quicker you can figure out and be able to relate to each individual person, I think the better leader you're going to be. Okay, so here's the thought process. If we're trying to get more of these leaders going, are there a couple of principles? Are there a couple things we can do that help us on that journey? And I've sort of concluded that, at least from my perspective, there's 4 principles that'll kind of help with this. And again, you ought to challenge all these, but this is the simple way I try to keep track of this so I don't lose myself. And I start off with what I call the most important one, which for me is self-reflection. And I'll define this, but I've actually come to the conclusion that the most important principle around leadership, from my perspective, is self-reflection. And here's the way I would propose to think a little bit about this. Even though I don't know most folks in the room, I would guess that most people here have at least 2 or 3 times the number of things you're trying to do than you're ever going to get done. I don't mean to disappoint you on a Friday morning. I don't mean to disappoint you. But if you think about your job, career, family, maybe your spirituality, health, exercise, fun, making a difference in the world, being part of things like Northwestern, we can go on and on. There's just a lot of things to do. Now, when you realize how much there is to do, and it's as motivated a group as this, the answer is obvious. We just go faster and faster, okay? This is where we get into our multi-focus thing. We're just in constant motion, right? And what I find fascinating is we're in such in motion that do we really know what we're doing, right? I always tease everybody, half the time I'm driving here from downtown on the Kennedy, people are driving, they're eating a Big Mac, they're texting, a couple of guys were shaving. There's a lot going on in a car, right? Why? Well, we got to get a lot done. And there's a couple questions I'll ask you may want to just jot down, reflect on, think about is, have we confused activity and productivity? Have we confused them? There's no question we're active. I mean, we're unbelievably active, okay? And we got all these great devices, you know, Blackberries and Blueberries, iPods. We've got all these things that supposedly were going to make us more productive. I don't know if we're more productive, but we're certainly more active. I mean, we're 24/7, right? So this whole thought process of, have we confused activity and productivity, all right? We've picked up another 300 emails. Have we gotten anything done? Okay, I don't know. Have we been able to separate urgent and important? I don't know. Do we know what we're doing? I'm not sure. Which gets me to this first principle, which is I actually believe that the people that are really value-based leaders are the people who take some time to think. They actually turn off the gadgets for a while, get off by themselves, and ask themselves a couple fairly basic questions. The types of questions I'm encouraging, whether it's the Kellogg students, executives, program people to think about, are the following. What are my values? What do I stand for? What really matters? What example do I want to set? Okay? What's my purpose? And I find by taking the time to really think about these things, you actually can start to separate urgent and important, activity and productivity. I think, at least for some of us, it helps me get from roots to trees to the forest. It helps me put things in perspective, right? Now, I find it helpful when I define terms for students to also define what it is not. This self-reflection is not self-absorption. This is not spending hours contemplating your navel, okay? This is, what are your values and what are you going to do about it, all right? Values to action. What matters and what are you going to do about it? What's the issue? What's the opportunity? How are you going to think about it? Now, some folks will say, well, boy, for a guy who was a math major, economics, accounting, CPA, this sounds a little philosophical. This sounds a little qualitative. Where's sort of the hardcore quantitative side to this? And I always have to explain something about math majors. I'm just curious. Do we have any math majors here? Any math? There may be some. Most don't admit it, so that's okay. I can help with that. So what math majors do, if you're not aware, is we put things into equations, even when there's no numbers involved. That's how we kind of convince ourselves of things. Maybe engineers do this as well, quantitative people. So what I did a couple years ago is I put together a 3-part equation to convince myself that everything related to leadership actually starts with self-reflection. And here's the way this goes. The first part is, if I'm not self-reflective, is it possible for me to know myself? I would doubt it. The second part is, if I don't know myself, is it possible for me to lead myself? I would doubt that. And the third part is, if I can't lead myself, how could I possibly lead other people? A then B, B then C, C then D, transitive property of equality, okay? It matters, okay? It really matters. So this whole idea of self-reflection. Now, some folks will say, well, can you give me some examples of this if we're going to be practical and concrete? And I'm always willing to give examples. My only sensitivity with examples, as I said early on, I don't have any answers. These are opinions. So I think it's important to do it. I like to think of it as 15 minutes a day. Some people may, oh, by the way, some people will say, Harry, that sounds like an interesting idea, but we just already agreed I got more things to do than time, so I don't know if I've got the 15 minutes. And I'll say, well, let's think about that a minute. Most of us commute someplace. Some of us try to exercise every day. Some people actually pray or meditate Maybe this is a little too personal. Maybe I'd be forced to think about a couple things I'd rather not think about, right? But wait a minute, we're talking about leadership. Leaders are willing to get out of their comfort zone. They're willing to kind of think through things that may make them a little uncomfortable. So, figuring out how you want to do it, that's up to the individual. But from my perspective, as an example, okay, I just take 15 minutes a day. And I'm one of these night guys, just like when I was at Northwestern, I usually don't go to bed till 1 in the morning. I just take 15 minutes at the end of the day. And my process is very simple. I just ask myself the following questions. What did I say I was going to do today? What did I actually do? What am I proud of? What am I not proud of? How did I treat people? How did I lead people? How did I follow people? If I lived today over again, what would I do differently? And the last one is, if I have tomorrow, because at some point I won't, but if I have tomorrow, next week, next month, and I am a learning person, what will I do differently based on what I learned today? And again, some process like that, I think actually does help people put things in perspective, right? And if you think about it, if you've really got your act together, which I think a big part of this is, it has an enormous impact then on how you lead, right? Because if Elizabeth is my boss, think of the range of relationships I can have with Elizabeth. On one hand, it could be, Scott says, well, tell me about Elizabeth. Well, she's my boss. Well, tell me a little bit about more. Well, I told you, she's my boss. Versus, I know Elizabeth, I know her values, I know what matters, I know she actually cares about me as a person and a colleague, and she may have a project that we got to get done the next 7 days. She can't get it done without me. But she realizes that my father has a serious heart condition in Minnesota and says, get your laptop, get up to Minnesota. We'll find a way to get that done, but that's where you need to be. Which, if you think about it, helps me relate to Elizabeth, which helps her influence me, which, as we said before, it's what leadership is all about. It's influence. It has nothing to do with control, right? So that whole area of self-reflection, I think, becomes really important in somebody that wants to lead. So any comments about self-reflection? I can feel the self-reflection in the room, by the way. I can feel it. But this is one, I'd really take the time to sort of think through, is that helpful? Does that matter? How does that help? Yes, sir. What's your name?
Robert.
Pardon me?
Robert.
Robert.
Yeah. When you're talking about the leadership, would the corollary be that you need to be encouraging those who work with you to put down a BlackBerry, sit down, think about what they're doing, particularly the example you gave. Think about what they're doing before they come and see you. I mean, I was a lawyer for 41 years, and always letting young lawyers come in and say, don't come in with a problem, come in with a solution,
right,
and we'll discuss whether your solution works.
Yep.
Please go think about it. And even legal profession, like other things, what we have lost over the years is the time and ability to contemplate what we're about to do and decide, is this the right thing to do, what are the consequences, etc. And so just more than doing it myself, I have to encourage those who are working with me to do the same.
Well said, Robert. Perfect. Yeah. In fact, in my class, we spend a couple of hours talking about that. However, my perspective is, until I figure that out, until I get my own act together, I'm not going to be able to influence you, right? That's that famous quote from Andrew Carnegie: the older I get, the less I listen to what people say, the more I watch what they do, right? So if I'm self-reflective, if I'm not running around like a lunatic, I've got my act together, then if I've got 5 or 6 of you guys, we're going to talk. Hey, Robert, you know what? Don't come and talk to me until you've really thought this thing through. I mean, again, the younger people may not relate to this, but Robert, to your point, because we've both been doing this for a long time, think about what's happened. Most people don't like to think about it, but I give you a financial example. If 25 years ago, my boss asked me to do a financial analysis on a company, and I got to run this projection by hand, okay, with a calculator, I'm going to take the time to think through, what's this company going to grow? What are the margins going to be? How much working capital is going to be necessary? How much capital expenditures? What's the risk? I'm going to take the time and think through all these assumptions, because it's going to take me an hour or two to run this thing. All right? What happens today? Today I tell a young person, hey, do a valuation of this company for me. Bang! 20 minutes they're in my office, and I'll say, Well, what's the growth rate and the margin? Well, Harry, I've run the model at growth rates from 0 to 100 every 50 basis points. The margin's from 20 to 40%. I've got 150 simultaneous equations and scenarios for you. Well, what do you think the value is? Well, Harry, depending on the assumptions, the value is somewhere between $2 and 100. That's all fascinating, okay? What do you think it's worth? Robert, what do you think it's worth? The expression on Robert's face? Migo, okay? I mean, hey, I'm not paid to think, I'm running numbers, okay? And that, again, that's why I keep talking, Robert, about this difference between activity and productivity. It's amazing, right? The other example I use with folks, 15 years ago, right, if I'm running international for Baxter, and you're my guy in Japan, Baxter Japan, all right? And we're introducing a product in Japan that's going well, and I have a meeting in Chicago and I say, hey, you know what? Maybe Robert ought to think about introducing this in South Korea and Taiwan. What did we do 15 years ago? 15 years ago, I wrote a little note, said, hey, Robert, think about this one. You got an 11-hour time difference. Let's figure out a time to talk. Get your team together. We'll get a meeting next Wednesday. I want to get your thoughts on this go, no-go decision, right? That's how we did it 15 years ago. You know how it happens today, Robert? Happens today. I'm walking through the campus, and I say, you know what? I wonder whether you ought to introduce this in Korea. So I leave you an email or a text. Now, I don't really care what time it is, because if it's 4 in the morning, you've probably got one of these little devices. It'll vibrate. You'll wake up, and you'll know that I sent you the message, okay? So you know within 15 minutes you better respond, or somebody's going to say, what happened to Robert, okay? So Robert now, out of a daze, looks at the email and says, I don't even know what he's talking about, but you know what? I'll respond, and I'll copy 20 guys on it, okay? Seriously. So 20 guys get the message. They're woken up in Korea, Singapore, China. It happens. They all get it and say, hell, I better respond fast, okay? Within an hour and a half, I'm walking through the campus. I got 180 emails. What do I say? Oh, I got 180 emails. Boy, this is great. No, I know nothing. I know absolutely nothing, because nobody has spent the time thinking about it, right? So, I mean, we've created this situation where nobody's thinking about anything, all right? I mean, I'm not going to get into politics, but think about any situation you want to, all right? How do we have a $17 trillion deficit? How do we not know from one moment to another what we're doing in Syria? We don't know what we're doing. Nobody's thinking about anything, all right? So I'm into this self-reflection, Robert, in a big way. Again, not self-absorption. Don't contemplate your navel. Just figure out what you're trying to do, all right? That's why it's number one, self-reflection. Now, second one is balance, okay? This one is really critical, having a balanced perspective. And here's think about people that you know are leaders, and does this really work for you or not? I could raise virtually any topic this morning. We could talk about Syria, the Middle East, Lance Armstrong, Penn State. We could talk about anything. Virtually any issue we bring up, immediately there'll be very strong opinions. Very, very strong opinions. The problem is, most people with very strong opinions have no understanding of the other side, right? Which gets me to this second principle, which is the value-based leader is the person who takes the time to understand all sides of the story, right? And I slow down to say all sides, because this is another thing I got from one of the Kellogg students. I first started to say they take the time to understand the other side, and one of the Kellogg students said, does that assume there's only two sides? I said, that's a good point. Sometimes there's multiple sides. So taking the time to understand all sides of the story. Another way this sometimes gets described as the effective value-based leader seeks to understand before they're understood, right? Because if you think about it, if I am the leader, by definition, I get the opportunity to make the final decision. I'm going to make a much better decision, as we talked about, if I understand what each of my people think, right? As we said earlier, I'm not trying to be right, I'm trying to do the right thing. So I really want to understand what each person thinks. I'll get a much, much better answer, all right? Having that balanced perspective. Yes, sir?
Isn't that the problem that we have in the media today, that nobody is willing to even acknowledge the other person's opinion?
Right.
We're getting people that are simply just talking to their own audience and not able to even engage anybody from the other side. So everybody's preaching to the choir,
Right.
but nobody is getting anybody to change their mind about anything because they're not even willing to acknowledge that they exist.
What was your name?
Dudley.
Dudley? Absolutely right. I mean, think about how ridiculous it is, right? Now, and again, I'm not even going to take one side or the other, but if you are a real conservative, Well, this is the show you watch, right? If you're kind of a liberal, this is what you watch. Well, that's interesting, but you already knew that. Wouldn't it be sort of fascinating to know what these other people think, right? Because most answers are somewhere in between. But if you only understand an extreme, how do you ever get anything done, right? I mean, again, remember we started this whole thing out, Dudley, simple common sense, right? I mean, use whatever you want. But here we are, blessed to be in an unbelievable country with unbelievable things, and we're sitting around with a, pick your number, $18 trillion deficit, right? So we have these people arguing, well, we can't increase taxes, of course, okay? And we certainly can't cut services, all right? Well, I don't know, but if I've got a job and I'm spending more than I have, something usually has to give, right? But we don't think this way because we'd rather have an extreme. So this inability to take the time to understand all perspectives. Because if you think about it, if you're a learning person, if you've got a liberal arts background, to understand, in fact, it's really interesting. If I even have thought that through, that I really believe I know the answer, if I have an interest in convincing you, the better I understand your perspective. If I can convince you, I understand your perspective, then when I make a decision, you're not going to say to the young lady next to you, well, he doesn't understand. No, I'm going to prove to you I really understand. In fact, I'm going to say, Dudley, is this what you believe? Is this why you believe it? Is this why you think that? Then maybe I'll gain a little respect and say, well, what about this or that? But if I'm unable to understand and appreciate the other perspective, no wonder we get nothing done. It's huge. Yes?
Maybe this is more of an actual kind of media thing, but at what point, though, does trying to include all of the sides of the story? I mean, there are some times where just by the facts, like acknowledging another side or the other side is equally as absurd in some ways as it's just kind of absurd. Like, at what point do you just say, this is, there's not facts to it, there's not, and again, maybe this is more of a media kind of world than a business world question.
Yeah.
But, I'm thinking of examples where, the other side and other side of the story is...
Doesn't have credibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sure. If it has no, you're right. You're right. If it has no credibility and no fact basis, for sure. But I would actually say in many, many cases, if you've got bright people on both sides, at least appreciating and understanding their perspective is going to help you get to a much better answer. Much, much better answer. Yes?
So, this is more of a political side of things. Do you see a correlation between people who are strong leaders like this and people who tend to be more independent? Not necessarily Democrat or Republican, but because the independents tend to look at both sides and consider both sides. They're willing to vote Republican, willing to vote Democratic,
Yeah.
depending on the person as opposed to depending on the side.
Yeah.
Is there some correlation to that?
I think if somebody's independent, there's a higher probability they'll do that. I would like to think that somebody could be Republican or Democrat without viewing, well, if I'm a Republican, I have to believe these 35,000 things, okay? Which is sort of the hole we've gotten ourselves into now. So, I'm going to assume that we're a little self-reflective. I'm going to assume we've thought through balance. That gets me to the third principle, which I define as true self-confidence. Now, when I mention and talk about true self-confidence, what often happens, people say, what's the true thing? I mean, you're either self-confident or you're not. Well, my experience, maybe share with some of you, I've worked for a lot of people who can act very self-confident, who have no self-confidence at all. This is that macho group of do what I told you to do, I've never made a mistake crowd some of us have dealt with, right? I'm not talking about that. When I say true self-confidence, and this is another one you can reflect on, do you have true self-confidence? And I'll give you a couple ways of thinking about this. One way for me that's pretty simple is an obvious realization. There will always be people brighter than I am, more athletic than I am, more articulate than I am, but that's okay. I know what I know. I know what I don't know. I'm a learning person. I'll get better each and every day. Some people describe it as you're comfortable in your own skin. If we're going to describe what true self-confidence, in my opinion, is not, this is not egotistical. It's not arrogant. Nor is it complacent. It isn't, I'm good enough. No, every day I'm given, I can get better than the day before, right? I'm a work in process, right? But I've got true self-confidence. Now, if you're sitting there saying, hey, I kind of wonder, this is worth thinking about, I'll take a little walk along. Do I have true self-confidence? Here's a couple other ways of thinking about it. Have you reached a point yet, 20, 30, 40, 50, 70, 80, whatever, have you reached a point yet where you're comfortable to say, I don't know? Are you comfortable to say, I was wrong, hey, forget what I said, let's do what Scott said, that makes more sense? Because if you reached a point where you don't have to be right, that's huge, right? Think of some of the people we've dealt with. I'm related to some of these folks in the race. They've never made a mistake. They have never made a mistake, okay? I mean, ever. Well, that's a tough place to be. That's a real tough place to be, right? Because if you can never make a mistake, it's like carrying an anvil around, right? As opposed to, you know, here's my opinion. I think what you're saying makes more sense. Forget what I said. Let's do that, right? Now, this whole idea only works, by the way, is if you're comfortable saying, this is what I know and this is what I don't know. Now, if you're comfortable with that, what you do is, in my opinion, is that you surround yourself with people that know more than you do about the things you're not that good at. Not a revolutionary new concept, right? This is that team thing from like thousands of years ago. So you say, all right, well, boy, that doesn't seem to work well in a lot of organizations. Why is that? I think it's because there's a lot of people that have trouble admitting what they don't know, right? I talk to a lot of executive groups, and very often on a break, I'll have a senior person, maybe the CEO, come up to me and they'll say, you know, hey, Harry, this self-reflection thing, that's a powerful concept. The balance I get, but this true self-confidence, I got a real problem. I'll say, well, I'll just name the guy Joe. Well, Joe, what's the problem? Harry, I got 800 people working for me. I am not sure I want those 800 people to know what I'm not good at. I hold my cards close to the vest. I don't think I want to divulge that. And of course, I'm the one who has to explain to Joe, Joe, they already know what you're not good at. Okay, all right. No show of hands in case your boss is in the room, but has anybody worked for somebody you couldn't write a book on what they weren't good at, right? I could write some very long books, okay? But if Elizabeth is my boss, again, here's how I try to keep this simple. If Elizabeth's my boss, I'm hoping she isn't good at everything. If she's good at everything, she doesn't need me, okay? So you have to be comfortable. You know what you know what you don't know, right? And you get better at it. True self-confidence. Which gets me to the fourth and final principle. Genuine humility. Now, I put these in a very specific order because I think if you're self-reflective, if you start to be balanced the way Dell and I were talking about it, if you're starting to realize you don't have to know all the answers and find out who does, this starts to maybe work for you. But let me elaborate as to what I think we want to all do to get a little better at this. Because it's more simple than you'd imagine. If I do surveys, as I do when I talk to companies and groups around the world, I'll ask people, we won't have time to do this today, but I'll say, we got a lot of accomplished people in the room, right? How did you get to where you are? How did you get to where you are? The two most frequent responses, virtually anywhere, are one, Harry, I worked very hard, and two, I've got some really good skill sets. And the combination of working hard and having some specific skill sets, that's how I got to where I am. Now, that sounds fairly logical. You know, you work hard, you got certain skill sets. When I self-reflect on this, and I try to be open about it, at least in my case, in my career, there were four other things that went on. Maybe applicable to you, maybe not. But in no particular order, but math majors, we number things. Number one, luck. Let's pause on luck, all right? Huge for me. Second, timing. Being in the right place at the right time was huge. Now, some people connect luck and timing. Timing was so big for me, I give it its own special category, okay? There were a couple of times, candidly, I got promoted that the person who I replaced, when that person was in the job, they accomplished nothing. You replace these people, you can look fantastic. You really can look fantastic, okay? Luck, timing. The third one for me was the team. All right? If I wasn't blessed to have the teams I had, I never would have been promoted. All right? I had great teams. And then the fourth one, a little bit more personal, but for some of us, there's a spiritual element to this, right? It's not all about us. There's somebody else involved in the play. And if any of those four work for you, maybe they don't, all four don't, but if any combination of luck, timing, the team, spiritual dimension, I think what begins to happen, if you think about it, is you realize, first of all, I won't forget where I came from. Most of us start off with nothing. Right? So if you start off with nothing, and you keep things in perspective, you keep your feet on the ground. Some people describe it as you don't read your own press clippings, or if you do read them, you don't believe them. You just keep centered. And by the way, some of you who have been successful at this know this, a big part of this is you have to have a couple people around you who knew you win. Maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's somebody you play ball with, maybe it's somebody who's got pictures on you. I don't know what it is, okay? Okay, but having a group of people who don't let you get caught up in this, because think about it, if you're doing well, I mean, we won't mention names, but I went to school here with a bunch of folks, they were very normal people. We played ball together, played a little poker, had a few cigars, did a little swimming. They're pretty normal people. Now, you can't talk to these people. Why? Because there were so many people who told them how remarkable they were. Think about it. If somebody tells you, Elizabeth, how phenomenal, remarkable you are, you could actually believe it, okay? You got to have people who keep you grounded, okay? Who help you realize that luck, timing, the team, something else is at play here. And then if all those things happen, then I think you are able to relate to everybody, right? Because most people in an organization don't relate to somebody who people think is godlike, right? So your ability to truly relate to people, again, helps you influence people, helps you lead people. So a couple things to think about. By the way, the expression that I use on this genuine humility, if we had a lot more time, but its summary, I would summarize it as, remember the cube. Remember the cube. Because most of us start in a cubicle, or a bullpen, or a car if you're a sales rep, or a bench if you're a scientist. If you can actually remember what it was like when you first got out of Northwestern and in that very, very first job. I mean, I can remember it like it was yesterday. If you can remember that, and if you never forget it, it's huge. It's really huge. I mean, I got to tell you, 35 years ago when we were in cubicles, we had a bunch of concerns. One concern was, we may never get out of this cubicle. This could be the next 40 years of my life, okay? So to humor ourselves, we said, all right, if we did get out of the cubicle, what would we do different? Okay, so was it Kevin? Kerry. So, if I just to tease him, Kerry's our boss. We're sitting there saying, why does Kerry call us into his office at 6 o'clock every Friday to tell us what he needed for Monday? Where was he on Wednesday, right? Because if I knew where he was Wednesday, maybe I'd stay up all night Wednesday so I could spend time with the kids over the weekend, right? Or communication, right? Kerry's going to make a presentation, and we're up putting overheads together, right? In the old days, it does a little white barrier around the thing. We had like 80 of these little suckers, right? And why are we putting 80 together? Because somebody may ask you a question, so you're going up to see those guys at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning with this big stack of overheads. We're going to have you very, very prepared. Presentation is 8 to 10. So what are Jim and I thinking? Well, 10 o'clock when you come back, what went well, what didn't go well, maybe we can go to sleep. So what happens? You go up at 8 o'clock. It's 10 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock. Around noon, Jim starts to say, what did they do to him? Okay, did they kill him? Where is he? Okay. Well, turns out you decided not to come back. I know, you're out playing 18 or something. As opposed to, no, wait a minute. If we're in a meeting from 8 to 10, at 10:01, we're back there. Here's what went well. Here's what didn't go well. Get a little sleep. We'll deal with it later. You treat every single person the way you want to be treated. And if that becomes part of the way you think, it has an enormous impact. I always tell the students, those of us that are working downtown Chicago, if you're working on something and you're thinking you're going to get out there at 7 or 8 o'clock, at least downtown in our building, you always know when it's 11. Because at 11 o'clock is when the cleaning crew comes in. Well, when the cleaning crew comes in at 11 and you look at your watch, oh boy, I missed another train, I got to get out of here. Very easy to grab your briefcase, grab your purse and leave, okay? However, if you really think this thing through, you say to yourself, wait a minute, if it wasn't for these 4 people coming in cleaning this place, it wouldn't look the way it does. Those people are key to the whole organization. How tough could it be to put down your briefcase and empty out 10 or 12 trash baskets with these folks? Often they don't even speak English, so maybe I show them a couple pictures of my 5 kids. They show me a couple pictures of theirs. I thank Scott for, hey, thanks for helping up with the place. It really matters. It really matters because, quite frankly, in my case, if it wasn't for luck, timing, the team, and something else, I'd be part of the cleaning crew, right? We're all in this together. And the last part, which I think most of us realize, but I don't think we actually live it, is we're living in a world today where there's no secrets. I mean, maybe 30 or 40 years ago there were a few secrets running around. There's no secrets today because everybody finds out everything. And it's so instantaneous that every time you see something absurd happening in the press, I always sort of have 2 reactions. That person did what? But, if you kind of get over that, then you say, but did they actually believe nobody would find out? I mean, what? I mean, hello, how could that be, right? And the best example I can think of how there are no secrets, Julie and I always take our 5 children down to Florida for spring break every year. So we're down at this little place by Siesta Key by Sarasota, and one of the children has to go to the bathroom, so I'm walking them back up to the hotel, and a Baxter truck rolls into the hotel, and there was a patient there that they're delivering product for, and I made the mistake early on with the children when they said they saw a Baxter truck, and they said, well, Dad, is that your truck? And I thought, I own stock in the company. I'm going to say, yeah, I guess it is my truck. Well, the 4-year-old, every time he saw a truck, Dad's truck, Dad's truck. So I walk over to the truck, and it's like 90 degrees. The guy's unloading boxes. And I said, hey, my son and I, we can help you unload the boxes. It's like 10, 15 minutes max. So we finished unloading the boxes, and the guy's getting back in the truck. And he said, well, what's your name? I said, oh, it's Harry. Where are you? Chicago. That was it. That's it. So the next morning, of course, we all know when we're on vacation, the one thing we're not supposed to do is check our email or whatever. So 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm locked in the bathroom without the light doing my email. Okay. Okay. And I open my email. I've got like 80 messages from truck drivers. And I open up the email. Harry, I am the Baxter truck driver in Topeka. When are you coming to Topeka to empty my truck? Okay. Now, again, all I can figure is, the guy just asked me my name. I said Harry. He probably was talking to some other driver on his phone. Hey, I met this guy, Harry. Well, there's not a lot of Harrys. Where is he? Chicago. Somebody must have seen my picture. Hey, that's the CEO of the company, right? So if you think about leadership, we're blessed with the ability to have an enormous impact on people. Now, that impact can be for good, or pick up the press, it can be for really bad things. So this whole idea of if, that famous 2-letter English word, right? If we can keep things simple, employ a little common sense, get people to get started, and again, it's a journey. We never get as self-reflective as we like. We never get as balanced as we'd like. Hopefully, we're continuing to try to improve our true self-confidence. Never forget where we came from, genuine humility, remember the cube. I think we're on our way. Because one of the key things that hopefully all of us in this room realize, no pressure, but we are those guys, right? So, good luck.